a shattered wine glass, a $3,000 vintage Merlot, bleeding into the pristine dove-gray fabric of the city's most feared crime boss. The entire five-star restaurant stopped breathing. The guards reached for their holsters. But what Arthur Moretti said next to the trembling, overweight waitress didn't just shock the room. It changed the underworld forever. Clara Jenkins was deeply accustomed to apologizing for her own existence. At 240 pounds, she moved through the world, and specifically through the narrow, meticulously arranged tables of L'Etoile d'Or, with a hyper-awareness of the space she occupied. High-end Manhattan dining establishments were not built for fat women. They were designed for the skeletal elite, the wealthy patrons who picked at microgreens, and the willowy, aspiring actress waitstaff who floated between the aisles like ghosts. Clara did not float. She anchored. Her uniform, a stifling black corset-style vest over a crisp white button-down, had to be custom-ordered, a fact the restaurant manager, Mr. Charles Henderson, reminded her of frequently. He was a small, bitter man who worshipped wealth and despised anything that didn't fit his narrow aesthetic of perfection. He only kept Clara on the payroll because she possessed a near-photographic memory for the ever-rotating menu, fluently spoke French to the kitchen staff, and had a palate that could blindly identify a vintage Bordeaux from a cheap knockoff. She was a liability to his eyes, but an asset to his operations. It was a rainy Tuesday night in late October when the atmosphere in L'Etoile d'Or shifted from its usual hum of pretentious chatter to a tense, suffocating silence. In the kitchen, Chef Louis was sweating profusely, screaming at the line cooks. Out on the floor, Jessica, the head waitress who usually pranced around the VIP section hunting for wealthy bachelors, was hiding in the coat check room, her hands shaking as she touched up her lipstick. The reservation had been made only an hour prior. A party of 4. The name on the book was simple: Moretti. Arthur Moretti was a ghost story whispered among the city's elite. On paper, he was the CEO of a vast shipping and logistics conglomerate. In reality, he was the ruthless architect of the largest organized crime syndicate on the East Coast. He didn't deal in street-level thuggery. His weapons were blackmail, extortion, and absolute, terrifying control over the city's infrastructure. He was a man who could bankrupt a senator with a phone call or make a rival disappear into the foundations of a new skyscraper. He demanded perfection, and he was known to destroy anything that fell short of it. "I can't go out there," Jessica hissed, clutching Clara's arm near the swinging kitchen doors. "Did you see them? The guys with him? They look like they eat people. One of them just stared at me, and I swear my soul left my body." Mr. Henderson materialized behind them, his face pale, a sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead. "Jessica, get to table 7, now." "Mr. Henderson, please," Jessica whined, her voice cracking. "I'll mess up. I'm shaking. I can't serve him." Henderson's eyes darted wildly. He couldn't risk a nervous waitress dropping a plate, but he also couldn't keep the city's most dangerous man waiting. His gaze snapped to Clara. He looked her up and down, his nose wrinkling with unmistakable distaste. "Clara," Henderson snapped, "you take the VIP section." Clara's heart plummeted into her stomach. "Sir, I'm already handling the East Wing." "I don't care," Henderson hissed, stepping uncomfortably close. "Jessica is having a breakdown. You're going to take over table 7. You will be invisible. You will be silent. You will not stumble. You will not sweat. And for God's sake, pull your vest down. You look unkempt. If your clumsy, oversized frame ruins this evening, I won't just fire you, Clara. I will make sure you never work in this city again. Do you understand me?" Clara swallowed the thick knot of humiliation in her throat. She had bills to pay, a sick mother in Queens whose medical debts were drowning them both. She couldn't afford pride. "Yes, Mr. Henderson." She took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over her apron. The friction of her thick thighs, rubbing together beneath her black slacks, felt louder than the jazz music playing softly overhead. She picked up the heavy silver tray, laden with 4 glasses of ice water and the complimentary amuse-bouche, and pushed through the double doors into the dining room. The VIP section was a semi-private alcove elevated by 2 steps, separated from the main floor by heavy velvet ropes. As Clara approached, she felt the sheer gravity of the men sitting there. There were 3 men. 2 of them were clearly muscle, broad-shouldered, quiet, their eyes scanning the room with the predatory alertness of wolves. But the man at the head of the table commanded the space without moving a muscle. Arthur Moretti was older than Clara expected, perhaps in his late 40s. He possessed a sharp, aristocratic profile, with silver dusting the temples of his dark, impeccably styled hair. He was wearing a light dove-grey Tom Ford suit that looked as soft as water and likely cost more than Clara's annual rent. His dark eyes were fixed on the man sitting across from him, Thomas Greco, his underboss, who was leaning forward and speaking in hushed, agitated tones. Clara focused on her breathing, 1 foot in front of the other. "Be invisible." "Good evening, gentlemen," Clara said softly, her voice steady despite the frantic drumming in her chest. "Welcome to L'Etoile d'Or. May I offer you our chef's complimentary—" Arthur held up a single, manicured hand. He didn't look at her. "Just the wine, the 82 Chateau Margaux. And leave the waters." "Right away, sir." Clara nodded, quickly and expertly distributing the water glasses without making a sound. She retreated, feeling Arthur's bodyguards watching her every heavy step back to the cellar. Down in the wine cellar, Clara's hands finally began to shake. She retrieved the dusty bottle of Bordeaux, a legendary vintage priced at $3,000. She placed it carefully into the silver decanting basket, gathered the crystal stemware, and headed back up. She could do this. She had poured thousands of bottles. She just needed to survive the next 5 minutes, retreat to the shadows, and let the night pass. But the universe, it seemed, had a very different plan for Clara Jenkins. By the time Clara returned to the VIP alcove, the tension at the table had thickened into something suffocating. Thomas Greco's face was flushed red. He was leaning over the table, his voice a low, gravelly snarl. "It's a mistake, Arthur. The docks belong to us. Letting the Russians run a shipment through our port without a tax makes us look weak. You're getting soft." The 2 bodyguards shifted uncomfortably. You did not speak to Arthur Moretti that way. Arthur, however, looked completely unfazed. He sat back in his chair, swirling the ice in his water glass. "Patience, Tommy," he said, softly, his voice a dark velvet purr that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "The Russians are digging their own grave. I am simply handing them the shovels." Clara hesitated at the edge of the steps. Interrupting felt like stepping into a minefield. But lingering awkwardly with a $3,000 bottle of wine was equally dangerous. She stepped up, approaching Arthur's right side. "The 1982 Chateau Margaux, Mr. Moretti," Clara said, presenting the label. Arthur finally turned his gaze to her. His eyes were a startling, piercing black. They didn't hold the casual disdain she was used to receiving from wealthy men. They were cold, calculating, and entirely unreadable. He gave a sharp, single nod. Clara set the crystal glasses down. She used her silver foil cutter, cleanly removed the cap, and inserted the corkscrew. Her movements were practiced, precise. Pop! The cork slid out flawlessly. She poured a small tasting measure into Arthur's glass. He lifted it, inhaled, and took a slow sip. Perfect. Pour. Clara moved to fill the glasses, stepping slightly between Arthur and Thomas Greco to reach the center of the table. She lifted the heavy crystal decanter, the dark, blood-red wine catching the dim restaurant lighting. Suddenly, Greco slammed his massive fist onto the table. "I won't stand for it," Greco barked, his temper finally snapping. The sudden, violent impact sent a shockwave through the heavy oak table. The physical mechanics of the disaster happened in a fraction of a second. The table jolted hard, catching Clara squarely in her plush stomach. Thrown off balance, she instinctively stepped back, but the heel of her non-slip shoe caught on the edge of the elevated step. To save herself from falling backward and cracking her skull, Clara threw her weight forward, her thick thigh slamming hard against the corner of the table. Her hand jerked. The heavy crystal decanter tipped violently forward. Time seemed to slow to a terrifying crawl. Clara watched, paralyzed by absolute horror, as a thick, continuous cascade of deep crimson Merlot poured out of the decanter. It didn't just spill, it launched. The dark red wine splashed directly onto Arthur Moretti's chest, soaking into the pristine white silk of his dress shirt and spreading like a massive bloody wound across the lapels of his dove-grey Tom Ford suit. The liquid pooled in his lap, dripping down the edge of the leather chair and splattering onto the imported Italian marble floor. Clara gasped, dropping the empty decanter onto the table with a loud clatter. She stumbled back, clutching her hands over her mouth. The music in the restaurant didn't stop, but it felt as though every single human being in the room had simultaneously ceased to breathe. The clinking of silverware vanished. The quiet murmurs of the elite died instantly. Greco leaped out of his chair crashing backward to the floor. "You stupid fat cow!" he roared, pointing a furious finger at Clara. The two bodyguards moved with terrifying speed. In unison, they stepped between Clara and Arthur, their hands sliding smoothly into the interior pockets of their suit jackets, resting firmly on their concealed firearms. Clara began to hyperventilate. The blood rushed out of her head, leaving her dizzy and faint. She was going to die. Right here, near the oyster bar. I am so sorry," Clara choked out, tears instantly brimming in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. He hit the table. I lost my—" "Shut your mouth!" Greco spat, stepping toward her. From across the dining room, Mr. Henderson came sprinting. He shoved his way past a busboy, his face a mask of absolute, abject terror. He skidded to a halt in front of the VIP table, looking at the ruined suit, and then at Clara. "Mr. Moretti!" Henderson cried out, his voice shrill with panic. "I am so deeply, deeply sorry. I apologize for this catastrophic incompetence. She is fired. Immediately. I will cover the cost of the suit, the dry cleaning. The meal is entirely on the house." Henderson turned on Clara, his face contorted with rage. I told you your clumsy, oversized body was a liability. Get out of my restaurant. Get out before I have you arrested for property damage, you useless fat pig." The insult hung in the air, cruel and sharp. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a hot tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. She was utterly broken. She reached to untie her apron, ready to run out the back door and never look back. Henderson. The voice was not loud. It wasn't a shout. But it possessed a cold, vibrating authority that immediately froze the oxygen in the room. Arthur Moretti slowly stood up. The dark red wine was still dripping from his cuffs, staining his hands like blood. He didn't look angry. He looked dead. He bypassed his bodyguards, who parted for him seamlessly. He ignored Greco. He stepped directly in front of Mr. Henderson. "Did you just speak to this woman?" Arthur asked softly, his dark eyes locking onto the manager. "By insulting her physical appearance?" Henderson blinked, completely thrown off guard. I was disciplining her, sir. She ruined your suit. She is a clumsy—" "Quiet." Arthur didn't raise his voice, but Henderson snapped his mouth shut so fast his teeth clicked. Arthur turned his gaze to Clara. She was shaking uncontrollably, her face red with shame, her large frame hunched inward, as if trying to fold herself into nothingness. Arthur reached into his pocket and withdrew a spotless, white cotton handkerchief. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped into Clara's personal space. She flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, Arthur gently pressed the soft cotton to her cheek, wiping away the stray drop of wine that had splashed onto her skin, along with her tear. "Look at me, Clara," Arthur commanded softly. Clara opened her eyes, meeting his dark, piercing gaze. Arthur turned his head slightly, locking eyes with his underboss. "Greco, you threw a temper tantrum like a child. You slammed the table. You made her spill the wine." Greco's face paled. "Boss, come on. It's just a waitress. Look at her. She barely fits in the aisle." "Dante," Arthur said calmly to his bodyguard. Before anyone could blink, the bodyguard stepped forward, grabbed Greco by the back of his neck, and slammed his face brutally into the heavy oak table. The loud crack of cartilage echoed through the silent restaurant. Diners gasped. Greco groaned, blood pouring from his broken nose onto the white tablecloth. Dante yanked him back upright, holding him by the collar. "Apologize to the lady," Arthur said to the bleeding underboss. I'm sorry," Greco gurgled, blood dripping over his lips. Arthur turned back to the trembling manager, who looked like he was about to wet his pants. "And you?" Arthur stepped closer to Henderson, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "If I ever hear you speak to a woman like that again, if I ever hear you utter a word about her weight or her worth, I will buy this glass palace, fire you, and make sure your teeth are scattered across the floor before I burn it to the ground." Henderson nodded frantically, tears of terror in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." Arthur turned back to Clara. The menacing, lethal aura that had just filled the room vanished, replaced by an unsettling gentleness. He looked down at his ruined suit, then up at her wide, tear-filled eyes. "It's just a suit, sweetheart," Arthur murmured, loud enough only for her to hear. "Now, why don't you bring me a towel, and perhaps you can join me for a drink? I think you've earned a break." The plush, velvet-upholstered chair felt obscenely soft beneath Clara. For the past 4 years, she had only ever stood in the VIP alcove, her back aching, her feet throbbing in cheap non-slip shoes, waiting for the dismissive flick of a wealthy hand. Now, she was sitting. Across from her, Arthur Moretti was casually dabbing at his ruined Tom Ford suit with a warm, damp towel she had brought from the kitchen. The blood-red stain of the 1982 Chateau Margaux was permanently set into the white silk, but Arthur seemed entirely unbothered. The restaurant around them remained in a state of suspended animation. At the far end of the room, Mr. Henderson was leaning against the mahogany host stand, practically hyperventilating into a linen napkin. Thomas Greco, clutching a towel over his shattered, profusely bleeding nose, had been unceremoniously escorted out the back door by Dante. Arthur tossed his ruined, wine-soaked towel onto the silver platter. He reached for the crystal decanter, which miraculously still held a third of the legendary vintage. He poured a generous measure into a fresh glass and slid it across the heavy oak table, right to Clara. "Drink," Arthur commanded softly. It wasn't a request. It was a gentle, unwavering directive. Clara's thick fingers trembled as she wrapped them around the delicate crystal stem. She brought the glass to her lips. The wine was extraordinary. Complex notes of blackcurrant, cedar, and dark chocolate hitting her palate. But she could barely taste it over the metallic tang of adrenaline in her mouth. "Why did you do that?" Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the soft jazz playing from the overhead speakers. She looked down at her own lap. "He was right. I am clumsy. I ruined your night." "Thomas is an animal who lacks control," Arthur replied, leaning back in his chair. He steepled his fingers, his dark eyes analyzing her with a terrifying intensity. He slammed a table. "Physics dictates the wine falls. The fault was his. But more importantly, Clara, I do not tolerate disrespect toward women, especially women who are working hard to keep their heads above water." Clara's head snapped up. Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, the one part untouched by the spill, and withdrew a sleek, black leather Prada wallet. He didn't take out cash. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper and slid it across the table. Clara hesitated, then picked it up. Her heart stopped. It was a photocopy of a medical billing statement from Mount Sinai Hospital. The patient listed was Mary Jenkins. The outstanding balance for 3 rounds of aggressive chemotherapy and an extended ICU stay was highlighted in yellow, $142,500. Next to it was a late notice from Chase Manhattan Bank regarding a foreclosure on a small row house in Queens. "How?" Clara gasped, the air completely leaving her lungs. She looked around frantically, suddenly feeling exposed. "How do you have this? Who are you?" "I am a man who makes it his business to know everything about the spaces I walk into," Arthur said, his voice smooth, hypnotic. "When I made the reservation at L'Etoile d'Or, I didn't just book a table. My people pulled the files on the staff. I like to know who is handling my food, who is pouring my wine, and who is listening to my conversations." He leaned forward, the ambient light catching the silver at his temples. "I know that you work 60 hours a week. I know you have a photographic memory for the menu, that you speak fluent French because your grandmother was from Lyon. And I know that Charles Henderson pays you 20% less than the other waitresses because he thinks your weight makes you desperate enough to stay." Clara's cheeks burned. The shame was paralyzing. "So you pity me. Is that it? The big mafia boss felt sorry for the fat waitress?" "Pity," Arthur scoffed, a genuine dark amusement dancing in his eyes. "Clara, I am Arthur Moretti. I don't feel pity. Pity is for the weak. I deal in assets. And you, Clara Jenkins, are the most undervalued asset in this entire zip code." Clara blinked, entirely bewildered. "An asset? Do you know why wealthy, arrogant men like Thomas Greco and Charles Henderson treat you terribly?" Arthur asked, his tone dropping into a deadly serious register. "Because they are superficial fools. They look at your size and they dismiss you. They think physical softness equates to mental slowness. They look right past you, Clara. To them, you are invisible." Arthur leaned closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. And in my line of work, invisibility is the most dangerous weapon a person can possess. Clara's mind was racing. The initial terror had faded, replaced by a strange, intoxicating warmth. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Nobody had ever looked at her heavy frame and seen power instead of a punchline. "Next Thursday," Arthur continued, his voice dropping lower, "a man named Jean-Luc Beaumont is dining here. He is a Swiss banker who launders money for a rival faction out of Chicago. He is cautious. He sweeps his hotel rooms for bugs. He uses encrypted phones, and he never speaks in English when discussing numbers. But he loves this restaurant, and he loves speaking French." Clara swallowed hard, the pieces clicking together in her sharp mind. "He sits in the East Wing. I've served him before. He always orders the duck confit." A slow, predatory smile spread across Arthur's face. It was a smile that made empires crumble. "Exactly. He knows you. He is used to you. And because he is a vain, arrogant man, he pays absolutely zero attention to you. You are just part of the furniture to him." Arthur reached across the table. His large, warm hand covered her trembling fingers. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight up Clara's arm. "I need to know exactly what Beaumont says next Thursday to his associates," Arthur said. "I need every name, every account number, every location. I need your photographic memory, and I need your French." "You want me to spy for the mob?" Clara whispered, the sheer absurdity of the situation almost making her laugh. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Moretti. I drop decanters." "You were pushed," Arthur corrected firmly. "And I don't want you to spy for the mob, Clara. I want you to work for me." He tapped the medical bills on the table. "You do this for me, and by Friday morning, Mount Sinai Hospital receives a wire transfer for $142,500. Your mother's house is paid off entirely. The deed will be mailed to her free and clear." Clara stared at the numbers on the paper. $142,000. It was a phantom number, an impossible mountain that had been crushing her chest for 2 years. She thought of her mother, pale and fragile in the hospital bed, weeping over the financial ruin her illness had caused. She thought of Mr. Henderson's sneer. She thought of the countless nights she had cried herself to sleep, feeling trapped in a body and a life she couldn't escape. Clara looked at Arthur Moretti. He wasn't playing a game. He was offering her a key to unlock her cage. But something inside Clara, a deep, dormant spark of defiance that had been buried under years of insults, suddenly flared to life. She slowly pulled her hand back from under his. She sat up straighter, her large chest expanding, her posture shifting from a cowering employee to a woman sitting at a table with a king. "No," Clara said. Behind Arthur, Dante the bodyguard actually twitched in surprise. Arthur's eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch. "No." "The debt is just to get me to zero, Mr. Moretti," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. The wine was giving her a terrifying courage. "If I am risking my life, if I am crossing the line into your world to hand you a Swiss banker on a silver platter, getting back to zero isn't enough." Arthur leaned forward, clearly fascinated. "What do you want, Clara?" "I want the medical bills paid," Clara stated, holding his gaze. "I want my mother's house paid off. I want a starting salary of $10,000 a month to act as your translator and observer, paid through a legitimate front company for tax purposes." She paused, taking a slow sip of the $3,000 wine. She let the silence stretch, feeling the intoxicating weight of her own sudden power. And? Arthur prompted, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Clara turned her head. She looked across the dining room to where Mr. Henderson was cowering behind the host stand, watching them with pale, terrified eyes. And, Clara said, turning back to Arthur, I want him fired. Tonight. I want him to pack his things in a cardboard box while I watch. For a long, agonizing moment, Arthur Moretti just looked at her. The silence was absolute. Then a deep, rumbling sound began in his chest. It spilled out of him, a rich, genuine, terrifying laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the restaurant. "Dante!" Arthur called out, still chuckling. The bodyguard stepped forward immediately. "Yes, boss. Find the owner of this restaurant," Arthur ordered, never taking his eyes off Clara. "Tell him I am purchasing a controlling share of L'Etoile d'Or, effective immediately. Have the paperwork drawn up by the lawyers in the morning." Arthur then gestured lazily toward the front of the room. "And throw Charles Henderson out onto the street. If he tries to take anything other than his coat, break his fingers." "With pleasure," Dante grunted, turning on his heel and striding purposefully toward the sweating manager. Arthur looked back at Clara. The amusement in his eyes had settled into something much deeper, something akin to profound respect, and perhaps the very dangerous beginnings of attraction. "You are a remarkably dangerous woman, Clara Jenkins," Arthur murmured, lifting his glass of wine to toast her. "It is an absolute privilege to do business with you." Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. She didn't feel fat. She didn't feel clumsy. She felt like a loaded gun. She raised her crystal glass, gently clinking it against his. "Cheers, Mr. Moretti. Let's go catch a banker." Who would have thought a ruined $3,000 suit would lead to the ultimate mafia glow-up? Clara proved that being underestimated is a superpower, and Arthur saw the Queen hiding beneath the apron. Will Clara survive the dangerous game with the Swiss banker, and will this business deal blossom into a deadly romance? If you loved this twist of power and respect, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter.